Greetings, everybody. This is episode number 16 of this course about implementing the CQRS pattern using the MediatR library. So in the previous episode, we implemented a couple of unit tests for our handlers, and we kind of talked about the different parts of those unit tests, the different techniques that are used. And I told you that it is better for you to be already, familiar with the different concepts in unit testing. And if you're not familiar, no worries. You can, check out some of the other courses that I've got here on a Coder's Journey channel. In the previous episode, I kind of told you that we're going to write an integration test or a couple of integration tests for our application as well to really see if the application returns the data that we need given the data that we're gonna feed into the application. So with integration tests, we're not going to mock anything. We're not going to mock our dependencies. We want to see whether all of the different components of the application, when integrated with one another, work as expected or not. So this is the note for this episode. This is my, solution. So what I thought I would do is to first run the unit tests that we talked about in the previous episode. So I've got my text explorer here. I've already run the tests. They're working correctly. I can run them again. These are my unit tests, by the way. The one that you see at the top is the integration test. And if I run these as well, you see that these also pass, right? So what I want to do in this episode is to talk about these different integration tests and how I have, developed them. Of course, you need to be familiar with some of the topics that I've got here. In the previous episode, I think I kind of talked about the unit tests in like excruciating detail. I don't want to do that with the integration tests, and I'm kind of gonna assume that you already that you are familiar, with integration tests. And of course, I am going to create some courses probably about integration tests and upload them on the channel. So this is the code file that I've got. By the way, I've added this project. It is like a test project. As you can see, again, I've got a dependency, right, to the web application, and I've got these packages installed. So for integration tests, mostly what you need to do is to set up the project very much like the unit test project, right? But the way that you test your application is different. So in the case of unit tests, you kind of mock the dependencies, but when it comes to integration tests, you do not mock anything. You actually invoke the application, the API, send a post request or a get request to your endpoints, and then get the data, the actual data that your endpoint returns. And then you put some assertions, on those data. So I've got one single code file. As you can see here, I've got different integration tests for different endpoints that we've got, right? So an integration test for getting all of the employees, which we expect to return a list of employees. Another endpoint that we had was to add one single employee, and that endpoint is supposed to return the new employee that was added. Then we have another endpoint that is supposed to return an employee that is already in the database. So we give the endpoint the ID of the employee that we want, and that endpoint is supposed to return that that employee. And then another integration test that I have written is for the case where we've got the ID of an employee, but that employee doesn't exist in the database. So as you can see here, for this class, I'm using iClassFixture with this type parameter, web application factory, right, of type program. By the way, these are also here, right? So I directly started talking about these tests inside of my Visual Studio, but you can find them here as well. So one NuGet package that you need to install in your integration test is Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC testing. So if I come here, inside of my packages, you see this Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC testing. This is needed because you want to write integration tests, because you actually want to run your API, hit a couple of endpoints, and then verify the data that those endpoints are returning, right? And this is, of course, the test that we've got that we're going to talk about. And we are going to talk about these, notes that I've got here as well. Let's first talk about these, and then we will move on to the code. So these tests actually send HTTP requests, right? Think about this. Compare it to what we did for unit tests. In the unit tests, we do not send actual HTTP requests. We mock those dependencies. We actually invoke the handle method on our handlers, and then we verify the response. But when we want to implement integration tests, we actually need to send HTTP requests to different endpoints, like for example API employees, right? And then we assert the status code of our response and the content of our response, whether we are receiving like an actual like list of employees or not. The web application factory startup creates, I'm talking about this part, by the way, this part, web application factory, right? It kind of creates an in-memory instance of your application, of your web API, and this allows you to test the full request response pipeline, including routing, controller logic, mediator, dispatching, handler execution, and whatnot, using the fake data store, right? So let's first read these notes, and then I will take you to the Visual Studio window and talk about these. So testing the mediator flow, you can also perform integration tests that directly involve sending requests to the iMediator within a test scope. Right now, we're not doing this. Right now, we're hitting the endpoints of our web API. This is the way we've implemented the integration test. But you can also, skip this part and hit the mediator directly. This can be useful for testing the interaction between the mediator, handlers, and dependencies in a more focused way. And you do not, suppose you do not want to get involved with the different parts of the, web API, your web API application. You do not care about, handler execution, I don't know, like controller logic, routing. You just want to integrate test the mediator part of your application. That is also another option. This would typically involve setting up a test service provider that includes the necessary registrations for mediator and your application components. By adding these sections, the tutorial, and yeah, we're not going to talk about this part. So let's move on to Visual Studio and let's talk about this. So I told you that by using this iClass fixture, we type of web application factory and our program, right? And by the way, let me tell you something. If you take a look here, this is the program class that I am talking about. So this program kind of, when we create an iClass fixture based on this program, if I navigate to this program, you see that it takes me to this file inside of my web application, right? So by using this, I am actually able to run an in-memory instance of my web API and then test its endpoints. So then I've got these two, private read-only fields, an HTTP client and a web application factory of type program. And inside of the, constructor, I am capturing these inside of my, clients. So I am capturing this, factory of type web application program inside of this factory, and then I'm using this factory to create an HTTP client, and throughout my tests I am going to use that client to send HTTP requests. So let's talk about this one, for example. Let's take a look at what we are doing here. So here, as you can see, I am using the client to send a GET request to this endpoint, right? The endpoint which is supposed to return a list of employees. and then I am capturing the response inside of this object. And then I am going to assert a couple of things. First, I am going to assert that the status code is success. So it is within this range. And then I am asserting the header, the content type header actually, to verify that it is returning this value, application JSON, char set UTF-8 or character set UTF-8. So this is one assertion that I'm creating. And another assertion is about the content of the response. So basically what I am doing is that I am kind of parsing the content of the response, and I am converting it to a list of employees, and I am capturing this inside of this variable. And then I am asserting that it is not null. I am asserting that it is not empty. So basically I am asserting that whenever I send a request to this endpoint, the response that I get has this status code, success status code, has this as the content type header, and then when the content is kind of converted to a list of employees, because this endpoint is supposed to return a list of employees, when I convert this to a list of employees, it is not null, it is not empty. As you can see, I'm not marking anything. I'm not marking the fake data store. So the actual fake data store that is inside of this project, inside of this folder, is going to be used. The actual handlers, mediators, and everything is going to get invoked. This is what an integration is, and this is how it differs, compared to like a unit test. The next one is about when you want to add an employee with valid input, right? So again, let's talk about what is happening here. First off, I am creating this new employee, right? So this new employee has this name. Then I am going to send a post request, in this case, to this endpoint. This endpoint, when sent, when a post request is sent to this endpoint, to this controller, it is supposed to invoke this method, add employee, because this is the default HTTP post endpoint. This is the default HTTP get endpoint. This one, even though it is an HTTP get, this one is not going to get invoked because it has a name. So this is the default get endpoint. This is the default post endpoint. So back to our code now. Here. So again, we are sending a post request to this endpoint, right? And passing in the employee to the endpoint. And then we are going to do something with that employee inside of the controller, inside of that web API. And then we have our assertions here. First off, we assert that the status code of the response is 201, created, right? Then we assert that the location header is not null. If you remember, when we created an employee, we got the location of that employee inside of our location header. The next one is that, when we created that employee, we actually put that employee inside of the body of the response. So if I take the response and then the content, and if I convert it to one single employee, and then I capture it inside of this variable, I need to assert that this variable and the content of this variable, which is a nullable employee, is not null, right? And then I am asserting the name of my employee. If you recall, when we created an employee, we added these to the name of that employee as a suffix. This was the example of notifications. Do you remember we had two different handlers, right, for that notification? So we also assert the name of the employee after the employee has been added to the data store. The next unit test is about returning OK and the employee if it exists. So again, we are going to send a request to this endpoint, passing in the ID of an employee that exists inside of that database. And then we are asserting the status code. We are asserting the content type header. We are asserting, we are converting the content of the response to a single employee object. We are asserting that it is not null. We are asserting that the ID of that employee is 1, which is the ID that we passed in here. And of course, one thing that we can do right now, if for example, we were using like a real relational, for example, database like SQL Server, we could have created a test database. Right now, we do not have like a database. We have an in-memory list of employees. But if we were developing this application with a real database, we could separate our production database, our development database, and our test database. So in those integration tests, we could use like a test database, and that database could be configured in a way that after each test is run, that database is cleaned out. All the records are, removed, so that with each test case or test method, a clean version of that test database is used. But I'm not going to talk about that because that's, the topic of another like series dedicated to the topic of integration tests. Next. So this one is easy, right? Get employee by ID. If the employee doesn't exist, if the ID is not there, we're going to return not found. So if, for example, we send a GET request for an employee with this ID, which we know it doesn't exist, we are sending a GET request using our client to our web API, and then we are capturing the response, and then we want to assert that the status code of the response, right, is not found. So kind of 4 integration tests that I can, as I showed you, run one more time to see if they all pass or not, which they do. I know there are so many things about unit tests and integration tests that could be implemented here. There are so many things that we can improve, but again, as this course is not about unit testing or integration testing, I'm not gonna, dive any deeper, because I want to focus on the CQRS pattern. And yeah, that's it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed watching it. If that's the case, as always, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel, and stay tuned for the upcoming video.